Tonight, only a vacant lot remains in central Fresno, where 9 people died exactly 20 years ago. It is one of the worst mass murders in Fresno history when Marcus Wesson had his children and grandchildren shot dead in the back bedroom of their home.
It's one of the most infamous murder cases in Valley history. A story that sparks some dark memories with the mention of just one name, Wesson.
He goes, I'm not sure what we have, but there's some type of David Koresh type guy inside the house, and he's holding his family hostage and he's armed to the teeth.
On a late afternoon on March 12, 2004, in Fresno, California, several officers were summoned to a small blue home at 761 W Hammond Avenue to settle a child custody dispute that had turned violent. 2 women, accompanied by a large group of supporters, demanded the return of their small child, but the numerous occupants of the house refused to hand them over. In the middle of the conflict stood a 300-pound man with a graying dreadlock hair trailing to his knees. As the 2 sides screamed insults at each other, the man stood calmly at the door, helping the police ease out the situation. When the argument got heated, the man told police he wanted to say goodbye to his children and disappeared inside the house, closing the door behind him. He emerged 80 minutes later with blood staining his clothes, and the officers ran inside. When police got inside, the first thing they noticed is caskets stacked against the wall in the living room. They continued to call out for the children, telling them it was safe now to come out. As they moved down the back hallway, they started to search every room until a closed door opened to darkness. Using his flashlight, an officer saw an indistinct mass on the floor. Then, feeling along the wall, he found a switch and turned the light on. There was a pile of bodies on the floor. Babies, kids, women. Blood pooled around them on the ground, and the bodies were still warm. Officer Escarino yelled for an ambulance, then started grabbing wrists, searching for the pulse of life. He realized that none of them were alive. What police didn't know is that they just stumbled into the biggest mass murder in the city's history, and one of the most gruesome and complicated. The 5'9" man who committed the gruesome act and who stood calm at the center of the conflict was 57-year-old Marcus Wesson, the patriarch of that Hammond Avenue home. In the following months, as evidence emerged, the case got even more gruesome and complicated. Systematic child abuse and a degenerate father who perverted the Bible to create a harem, using his own daughters and nieces. DNA tests would reveal that Marcus was the father of all 9 victims, 7 of whom were from sexual relations with his own daughters and nieces. The list of the dead includes Jeva, 1, Sedona Vadra, 1.5, Marshy Christopher, 1.5, Ethan Laurent, 4, Jonathan Charles, 7, Aviv Dominic, 7, Label Carey, 8, Elizabeth Brainy Kina, 17, and Sabrina, 25. Of those, only the 2 eldest were born of his wife. The rest were product of incest.
9 lives taken too soon. Exactly 20 years ago, one of the most unthinkable mass murders in Fresno took place at this home in central Fresno. 2 decades ago, Marcus Wesson had his children and grandchildren shot in cold blood. Detectives say he fathered his wife, children, and grandchildren and had incestuous relationships with them. For Mayor Jerry Dyer, who was police chief at the time, it's still unlike anything he's seen before, with 7 young kids all shot in the eye.
In order to understand how can someone do such a thing, I think we need to look at Marcus's childhood, because it may be the reason for his depravity. Marcus was born to an alcoholic, sexually degenerate father, and a mother who was strict and religious. Born in Kansas in August 22, 1946, and the eldest of 4 children, young Marcus followed his family's drift from Missouri to Indiana to California to Washington. Father Benjamin Wesson never held a steady job and stayed home drinking and flirting with his own children. According to Fresno Bee, there was evidence that Benjamin Wesson had homosexual inclination. A childhood acquaintance of the family would later testify that the senior Wesson $50 as a boy to submit to oral sex. He later ran off with a teenage male relative to San Jose before returning to his wife and family a decade later. The mother, Carrie, was a Seventh-day Adventist who force-fed her children daily Bible lessons and whipped them with an electric cord, as a relative would later testify in court. As a child, Marcus Wesson's favorite game was to play preacher. Marcus dropped out of high school and joined the U.S. Army, serving from 1966 to 1968 as an ambulance driver. After his honorable discharge from the Vietnam War, Marcus settled in San Jose. There he met and moved in with Rose Solorio, who was 13 years older than him and already the mother of 8 children. In 1971, the 2 had a son together. When Solorio's daughter Elizabeth was 14 and Marcos was 27, he impregnated her as well. They got married in 1974 and the couple had 5 boys and 4 girls. In 1989, Elizabeth's sister Rosemary dumped off her 7 sons and daughters at the Wesson home because of her drug addiction. The total number of children living in the Wesson household rose to 16. The family had no consistent income and lived off of welfare and took shelter where they could find it, including an army tent, a trailer, and on boats, before settling in Fresno. Although his children were frequently reduced to digging through trash cans for food, Marcos always had money to buy fast food. Years later, when she was asked on the witness stand why her husband didn't work, Elizabeth Wesson would reply without a trace of irony, "You can't work when you are on welfare." Marcos believed society was full of sins and sheltered his children and shielded them from it. When the children didn't do their homework or Bible lessons, he hit them with a stick wrapped in duct tape or a small baseball bat. They weren't allowed to have friends and rarely left the house. When the kids did cross paths with strangers, they barely said a word, leaving the impression that they were polite and well behaved, when in fact they were extremely maladjusted to social interactions. At the Fresno household, Marcos's numerous children were so well hidden that many neighbors didn't know of their existence until they learned of their deaths. Brainwashed from a young age, the children believed everything Marcos said. They had no sense of what was moral or socially acceptable. All they knew was their father's law. He told them he was Jesus Christ and demanded their unwavering obedience. At one point during their upbringing, Marcos segregated his household, forbidding even brothers and sisters from associating with each other. According to his warped logic, he believed his children would develop sexual feelings for each other. Meanwhile, he cultivated his daughters and nieces to act as his servants. They washed his dreadlocks, scratched his armpits and belly. When the girls were 8 or 9, Marcos started molesting them. First, he fondled their breasts and genitals, then taught them oral sex, until finally he was having intercourse with them. He called these routine rapes loving, and told them it was a father's way to show affection to his daughters. Ruby Sanchez would later recall in court. While even the most primitive culture in the world denounced incest as taboo, Marcos Wesson enthusiastically endorsed it. He justified his sickness by reading his daughter's Bible passages containing reference to men with multiple wives. God wants a man to have more than one wife, he'd tell them. Ruby Sanchez would later tell Stand Courtroom that she agreed to marry Marcos when he was 44 and she was 13 during a ceremony performed in a bedroom. Sanchez put her child's hand on a Bible and Marcos covered it with his own, making her receive vows that culminated in "I do." Wesson did the same with his 2 daughters and another 2 nieces. He encouraged his child brides to compete for his affection, and they often grew jealous of the private time he spent with their siblings. When the girls reached high school, he forbade them from talking to boys. Dating was out of the question. Later, Marcus Wesson Jr. would testify that he found it strange his sisters didn't date, but that when he asked one of them about it, she simply replied, "I am not into it right now." Wesson was fascinated with David Koresh, the cult leader in Waco, Texas, who took multiple wives. The family was glued to the television during the federal siege of the group compound in 1993, during which Koresh and 80 followers died. "This is how the world is attacking God's people," Marcos told his family. "This man is just like me. He's making children for the Lord. That's what we should be doing, making children for the Lord." Not long after, Marcos started breeding with his daughters and nieces. He told them he wanted to have 1 child with each of them, but he couldn't stop himself and kept impregnating them. The young women viewed themselves as substitute to Elizabeth Wesson, who could no longer bear children. Beginning in the early 80s, the family squatted in the Santa Cruz Mountains in a large army tent. According to neighbors, Marcos didn't work and attended church meetings almost nightly. He shunned money because he said there was a better way. "Give your heart to God and He'll provide," according to the San Francisco Chronicle. The family also lived on a 23-foot sailboat that was permanently attached to shore in Santa Cruz Marina. The kids would scrounge for bottles and cans on the beach to turn in for cycling money and bathe in public restrooms. Local officials soon caught wind that a sailboat owner was living off public generosity, and in 1989 charged Marcos with welfare fraud. He pleaded guilty and spent 6 months in the county jail. By the fall of 2003, the family had moved on to a 63-foot tugboat in Tomales Bay, an hour north of San Francisco. The concrete and wood boat was rotten and didn't have a bathroom. The kids kept to themselves, rarely talking to locals and avoiding eye contact. Residents noticed that several of the girls had lispes, a type of speech impediment, and that even in hot weather, they wore clothes covering their bodies from neck to ankle.
As part of the story, the family returned to places they lived with Wesson, like Tomales Bay in Northern California. Although the family almost always lived together, they were isolated from the world.
At one point, 4 or 5 of the girls were pregnant. Although they had jobs at nearby convention center, their father controlled their paychecks to the point where they forced to pool their nickels and dimes to buy food at the general store. In the fall of 2003, sheriff deputies ruled the tugboat unsafe for children, and the family moved to Fresno soon afterward, where they bought a 1,066 square foot converted office building on Hammond Avenue and parked a yellow school bus in the driveway. The kids rarely left the house, and the women didn't engage with the neighbors. They kept their eyes to themselves, hung their heads submissively whenever they were spoken to, and mumbled their responses. City officials told Marcus that the school bus was too large to park in the neighborhood and that their home didn't meet standards for residential housing. They were given until March 12, 2004 to resolve these zoning issues. One can only speculate as to whether the impending deadline set into motion the horrific events that occurred that same afternoon. Some of the girls still had normal teenage inclinations. Marcos discovered Ruby Sanchez flirting with boys and beat her severely. She ran away 3 times, but always returned, having nowhere to go and not wanting to leave her child. But when she turned 22, she left for good and got married. Her sister, Sofina Solorio, also left. They became furious when they learned that Marcos continued to impregnate their sisters and cousins and worried about the welfare of their small children. On that fatal March day, they drove to the Hammond Avenue, determined to rescue their kids. The sisters knew they faced an uphill battle when they arrived at the house. Marcus Wesson had made a deal with them. If they ever abandoned his home, they had to leave their children behind. In the event that Child Services or another government agency came to split up the family, Marcus gave his offspring chilling instructions, which were later related in court by Sofina Solorio. If the authorities tried to remove the children, Marcos told his daughters and nieces to first murder their offspring before killing themselves. He would stay alive to explain their decision to the public. Solorio said the family held monthly meetings to discuss the details of the suicide plot, including how to shoot to kill. Rosa Solorio later testified that Marcos frequently talked about the second coming of Christ and asked his children whether they were ready to go to the Lord or to kill themselves.
This was, an incestuous relationship that we had never seen. And then we found out about their belief systems. It appeared on every indication that this was a cult.
Wesson believed he was Jesus, and if anyone tried to separate the family, then they would all go to heaven. And even went so far as to purchasing caskets from a local antique store months before the mass murder took place.
He had such incredible influence over his children and his wives that this was the outcome, that he was able to control the mind of people to do the unthinkable, very similar to what Charles Manson did.
Shortly after they moved into the Fresno home, Marcos bought 12 mahogany coffins at an antique store. The owner of the antique store told the press that a group of somber children loaded the caskets into a yellow school bus. How chilling to think they may have carried the same coffins in which Marcos intended to place their corpses. According to witness accounts, Ruby Sanchez and Sofina Solorio pulled up to the Wesson house around 2 p.m. on March 12, accompanied by several carloads of young people. "I came to get my son," Sofina said, rushing into the house to find 7-year-old Jonathan. She had the boy by hand and was walking out of the house when her sister Rosa snatched him away and stuck him in the back bedroom with the other children. Sofina would never see her son again. Sofina was pushed from the house, and Mark stationed his massive frame in the doorway to block her from re-entering. Some of the other family members called the 2 sisters whores and bitches and ordered them to leave. Sabrina Wesson, 25 at the time, pointed at her father's feet and told Ruby to bow down to her master before running to the back bedroom with the children. At 2:30 p.m., a squad car pulled up. The Wesson household kept a low profile, and the police had only visited twice before, once to take reports on a missing license plate and another time on the theft of a purse from a car. One of the responding officers would later say he heard a baby crying as he spoke to Marcus Wesson in the doorway. Marcus did not invite the officers inside, and they weren't allowed to enter without a warrant or a reasonable fear for public safety. Marcus remained calm as the crowd cursed and shouted around him, which led officers to believe that Marcus would work with them toward a peaceful resolution. But then, he suddenly turned and ducked into the house, slamming the door behind him. "He's going to hurt the kids," the two mothers shouted. One of the Wesson's sons told the police he owned a .22 caliber gun, and they called for a SWAT team. The police ordered the crowd to separate and took cover themselves behind the bus and trees. During the ensuing standoff, several witnesses reported hearing gunshots inside the house. The damning implication was that the police didn't move to stop the massacre once it began, but all the officers present denied hearing gunshots, an assertion that was fully supported by their police chief. The Fresno Bee interviewed several neighbors who contradicted the official account. Maria Diva, who lived a few houses down from the family, said she heard 4 gunshots as she was emailing her sister. Shortly after 3:30 p.m., she ran to the doorway and heard a woman screaming, "Not my babies, not my babies," before returning to her computer to quickly finish her message. "There has been a shooting here in front, and apparently there are deaths," she wrote.
9 lives taken too soon. Exactly 20 years ago, one of the most unthinkable mass murders in Fresno took place at this home in central Fresno.
Time that he said that, if they're trying to take their kids, that he'll kill them. And he did.
Hey, these people are strange. Nobody's ever talked to him. When the father would come out there, he was like supervising. He was standing with his arms like this, or he'd be sitting down.
Something terrible. Sad.
By the time the SWAT team arrived to evacuate the neighborhood, it was all over. Marcus appeared abruptly in the doorway, his black shirt and pants stained with blood. As officers grabbed him, he instructed them to use 3 handcuffs to encompass his thick wrists. The blood soaking his clothing was enough of a warrant to cause the officers to storm the house, and they rushed through the doorway, calling for the children. It didn't take long to find them, piled in the back bedroom. Each victim had been shot in the eye, and they were stacked youngest to oldest. On top of the pile was Sabrina, and a .22 caliber pistol lodged under her arm. 9 bodies were found. The officers searched under beds and in cabinets for possible survivors. There were none.
The overgrown grass and weeds of a vacant lot now sit where the worst mass murder in the city's history took place.
It'll certainly leave an indelible image across the city that hopefully will never, ever be replicated in any form.
15 years ago, 9 of Marcus Wesson's children and grandchildren were shot dead and stacked in a back bedroom of their central Fresno home.
All the bodies were stacked up like cordwood.
The twisted life the family led under Wesson's domination came to a halt in March of 2004 when Fresno police arrived at a domestic dispute at the family's central Fresno home. After a brief standoff, officers walked in to find 9 bodies piled in a corner, all shot to death. The murders ended a family secret the group hid for years, a life of beatings, insults, and incest. Even today, sharing the way they existed is difficult.
For all of the officers, March 12, 2004 would become the single most traumatic day of their professional careers. Many would seek counseling in an attempt to erase the horrific image of the stacked dead children from their minds.
The residence that once stood at 761 West Hammond Avenue may be gone, but the memories still haunt many of the first responders who discover the grisly details that fateful day. Chief Jerry Dyer had been Fresno's chief of police for less than 3 years when he got the call.
It was something that I don't think anyone in law enforcement will ever forget. And it was just horrific, the worst mass murder that we had experienced in the history of our city. And it wasn't just the fact that 9 people were killed, it was how they were killed, the lifestyle that was occurring in that household where Marcus Wesson convinced his family that he was God, that Jesus was a vampire.
Marcus was held at the Fresno County Jail for $9 million bail and charged with 9 counts of murder. DNA testing gave investigators foolproof evidence that Marcus had all the victims with his own daughters and nieces, and he was charged with an additional 14 counts of sexual abuse. His wife Elizabeth, daughter Kiani, and niece Rosa Solorio continued to voice their support for him, denying he had done anything wrong and proclaiming him to be a wonderful husband and father. His mother, Carrie, had mixed feelings. If Marcus is guilty, I would really feel disappointed in my country if it didn't make him face the penalty. Carrie Wesson told the Los Angeles Times, "But I am a biblical person too, and I don't believe in capital punishment. What I would like for Marcus to do is sit in prison and think about what he has done and read the Bible." In jail, Marcus wrote country western songs, which he sang for his visitors. In conversation with his family that were secretly recorded, he said he felt electric current in his head because God have given him angelic brain. I've never seen that except at the beginning of time when the angels were mixing with men, he said.
Years ago, the home was torn down where the murders took place, and now this dirt lot still remains vacant till this day.
There's no way that that property could have existed or continued to exist in a neighborhood without it bringing back horrible memories. I think property values would have been devalued.
In June 2005, the case came to trial in the Fresno County Superior Court. Marcus was charged with 9 counts of first-degree murder and 14 counts of sexual abuse. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. 50 witnesses took the stand during the 3-month trial. His lawyers argued that Sabrina held the .22 caliber Ruger Mark II pistol to the eye of each of the children and squeezed the trigger before killing her sister Elizabeth and herself. According to testimony, the young woman was so fond of guns, she carried cartridges in her purse and liked to play army, painting her face green and black, like camouflage. The argument was supported by expert testimony saying the sisters died an hour or 2 after the younger victims. Neither the fingerprint of Marcus nor Sabrina Wesson were found on the pistol. However, Sabrina's DNA was found.
Every chilling detail is still fresh for defense attorney Ralph Torres, who worked on the court-appointed Wesson defense team.
I see all the evidence. It was the most gut-wrenching part of the case where I was just a young father. I had a 5-year-old boy, and there was a boy that looked from behind like my kid.
Even in his 34-year career, it's a case that continues to stand out the most on his resume.
It was life-changing. I've never seen anything like it. I've done 16 murder trials since then, and nothing like it.
The prosecution argued that Marcus was ultimately guilty of the massacre because he prepared his children to kill and be killed. In this family, he was Christ himself, the ultimate authority figure who determined life and death. Prosecutor Lisa Gamoyan told the court, Rosa Solorio, 23, whose children Ethan, 4, and Sidona, 1, wore the golden wedding ring Marcus gave her on the witness stand and said she still loved him and considered herself his wife. Her support differed from the taped interview she gave Fresno detectives shortly after the slayings, when she admitted her conflicted feelings about Marcus. I do love Marcus a lot, she said in the interview. I understand what he did and everything, but at the same time, it's just that to me, he's my father, and I do not want to be responsible for putting him away. I just don't feel it's right for me to do. She told the court that Marcus bought the casket for their mahogany wood, which he planned to use on a renovation project. They could also be used as beds if needed. Elizabeth Wesson denied having knowledge of her husband's sexual relations with her daughters and nieces. How can I protect them if they didn't tell me? They never told me anything, she told the court. When the girl's belly started to swell, she said she just didn't ask who the fathers were. Her excuse was that her own mother had 10 kids with 3 different men, and her sister had 7 children with various men. She considered it mean and rude to ask about fathers, she told the courtroom. On the witness stand, Elizabeth Wesson looked at her husband before speaking, as if for direction. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing under the prosecutor's rapid-fire questioning, and several breaks were called to allow her to regain her composure. The publicity from the case had made her the object of ridicule and had torn apart her family. Elizabeth Wesson said she often was forced to sleep in her car. Lisa, the prosecutor, depicted Marcus Wesson as a master manipulator who brainwashed his daughters and nieces into thinking it was normal to have sex with him. He limited their access to education and the outside world until he had complete financial, physical, and emotional control over their lives, and convinced them that death was preferable to police interference with the family. The women's brothers, who were segregated from their sisters at an early age and left home long before the murders, also spoke out about their father in court. Marcus Wesson Jr., 22, said he was surprised when his sister and cousins, who weren't allowed to date, started showing evidence of pregnancy. They told him they got pregnant by artificial insemination, but he thought the whole thing was weird. When he learned that DNA proves his father sired children with his sisters and cousins, he told the court, "That's not right, I don't want that happening." Adrian Wesson, 29, was also suspicious because the babies looked like his father. In particular, they inherited Marcus Wesson's distinctive nose. Another son, Dorian 30, called his father insane because he thought he was Jesus Christ and believed in vampires, but also described him as highly intelligent. Kiani Wesson, one of the daughters, continued to defend her father to the end, blaming her cousin for the deaths because they tried to break up the family by retrieving their children. I am proud of all my family, of the way we were raised, she told the court, her voice breaking. After a little more than 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Marcus guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder and 14 counts of raping and molesting his 7 underage nieces and daughters. The jurors wrestled with the evidence for more than 2 weeks and ultimately decided that Marcus himself pulled the trigger on at least some of the victims. As the verdict was read, many of Marcus's surviving family members stifled sobs while Marcus himself remained quiet. He wore the same short-sleeved black shirt he wore throughout the trial and appeared to have shrunk to half the 300-pound he weighed at the time of his arrest. A month later, Fresno County Superior Court judge accepted the jury's recommendation for the death penalty. The judge also sentenced Marcus to 102 years in prison for sexually abusing his daughters and nieces.
Wesson sits on death row at San Quentin. In the summer of 2005, he was convicted of killing 9 of his children. He had fathered them with his wife, daughters, and nieces.
Marcus's defense team filed a motion asking the judge to grant their client a new trial or reduce his sentence to life in prison. Both requests were denied, with the judge stating that the continued love for him by some family members was the only leniency Marcus could expect, with jurors adding they felt vindicated by the judge's ruling. It was hard. We had a lot of sleepless nights. Jurors Alex Flores told the Associated Press, "It was a lot of work, but this is closure for us to feel we've done our civic duty." Today, Marcus Wesson, who is now 77 years old, is continuing to serve his death sentence at San Quentin Rehabilitation Center.
Today, Marcus Wesson, who is now 77 years old, is continuing to serve his death sentence at San Quentin Rehabilitation Center after being convicted in 2005. But Dyer, who saw Wesson in prison in 2008, is still angry that Wesson gets to stay alive.
Marcus Wesson was an evil person. He is somebody, as I said then, to national media. He deserved the death penalty then. He deserves a death penalty today. Unfortunately, that doesn't look like it's going to be the case.
In 2019, Governor Newsom halted execution in California and has since dismantled death row.